Hello, and thank you for joining this episode of DJ Shan Azure Remix. The reason you're seeing me first in the next series of videos is Matt and I actually recorded these videos in 2 longer segments. Rather than have you sit through 45 to 50 minutes of content, I thought I would structure it out so the 2 longer videos are actually 4 more snackable videos. Hopefully that makes sense. If you like what you see, please hit reshare, like, and subscribe for additional content. I've got a lot more ideas and topics to cover. Thanks. So let's talk a little bit, Matt, about declarative versus imperative, because we've mentioned declarative. We've kind of highlighted that's what a templated-based deployment would look like. I don't know, did you want to go into this section? Because I feel like you have a great way of describing this. And I want to make sure that this is kind of hit home, because there's 2 different flavors of deploying resources in Azure. They're both infrastructure as code, but one's declarative and one's imperative.
Yeah, and so a good analogy that I read here a while back was, and just to put it into perspective, for people who may not have the experience in computing, think about it this way. Declarative would be me sitting down with Shannon and saying, "Hey, Shannon, draw me a picture of a landscape," right? And then so I wouldn't care how Shannon does it. She just sits down, she draws me a picture of a landscape. Whereas imperative would be like Shannon sitting down to a Bob Ross video and walking through step by step how to paint this happy little tree over here and this happy little bush over there and this big fluffy happy cloud up here, and doing the step by step. So when it comes to imperative versus declarative types of coding, declarative really says, this is what I want, and this is what I want it to look like, but I don't care how you do it. I don't care how the control of flow changes. I don't, that stuff is under the hood, nothing that bothers me. Whereas imperative would be like me going into PowerShell and saying, okay, first I need to create my VNet. All right. So new, AZ VNet, right? Next, I need to create the virtual machine in the NIC. So now new NIC, new virtual machine attached to this NIC, right? And so it's step by step, telling the computer each instruction in which order that you want it to happen. And so, you can see in the slide here, the imperative has PowerShell commands, and those have to be, you have to list those in order, and then going back to change that later, if you need to add something else into your deployment, then you've got to go through that PowerShell and figure out where in what step that you need to add that and make sure that it's not going to affect anything else, right? Whereas declaratively, I say, okay, look, Azure, I have this resource, right, in my set of resources. And this resource is the type of the storage account, and it's got this name, and it's got, it's in this location, and it's, this storage account type, which would be geo-redundant, locally redundant, read access geo-redundant, something like that. So I just want this storage account in this resource group at this this location, this data center, with this name. Please make it so. And so you deploy that to Azure, and it says, "Oh, I see you need a storage account." Boom, creates it.
Yeah, and I feel like editing a template, and again, it doesn't have to be an ARM template. We're going to focus a lot on ARM template and the brand new Bicep language. But there are Terraform templates that do very similar work. The idea of moving it to a template where you have to change things, because as we know, storage account it can't be the same name. It has to be globally different each time you run your template deployment. So the idea is you would change the parameters. Whereas if you use PowerShell, you've got to rerun your variable input. You've got to then rerun everything in order. I feel like sometimes running a lot of stuff inside of PowerShell sometimes is a little bit more time consuming, just because you've got to make sure you do it in the exact order. Otherwise, it's not going to deploy correctly.
Right. And then what happens if you rerun that same script and half of the stuff is already built,
Yep.
and half of the stuff is not already built? Then PowerShell is going to error out and say, "Well, I can't create this. It already exists," right? And
Right,
so
exactly.
where are you at? You got to start your PowerShell script from somewhere in the middle, and not knowing, again, if you're starting in the right place, if something got forgotten, now it's going to fail again, and then you get in this big, whole mess of let's just delete the resource group and start over again, let this whole thing run. Oh, great, I just forgot something else in the PowerShell script. Let's delete it and rerun it again, right?
Right.
Whereas when you deploy a template, say, an ARM template in Azure, you deploy that template, it does everything it can. If it runs into an error, and I'm sure you've run into this with me a few times, Shannon, where you've deployed it and the template has half deployed, and then somewhere in the middle it will say, oh, couldn't do this, error, boom, and stuff starts breaking. And then you go figure out in the template what broke, and then you fix that, and then you rerun the template, and it says, oh, I see that this is already created. Okay, we're just going to skip that, and then we'll go to the next thing. Oh, this is created. Yep, that's there already. It matches up. Everything is good until it gets to the point where it finds something that hasn't been created, and it starts creating it.
Yeah, and we'll talk about the ways to run an ARM template later on in an additional session. Our hope today was just to go through the overview of infrastructure as code, highlight the value so that you get an understanding. So, if we think about this, everything can be placed into version control. So you can, it's a way to manage code that you create. You can think about versioning your environments. So if you have to go back to a different version, you've got an environment to go back to. It's going to be faster than a backup and a restore, which also kind of blew my mind a little bit, thinking about the fact that you could redeploy an environment from code faster than a backup and a restore. And it's the same development tools that your development teams are already using. So Azure DevOps, all the Git surrounding Azure DevOps Server, GitHub itself, Bitbucket's another one I used to see when I worked with customers. So, I mean, it's interesting that we're now sort of seeing that blend between dev and ops, which then is that corny joke of, I guess we're getting to the point of it being closer to DevOps, right? You kind of feel a little bit like a software developer. Obviously infrastructure folks, we're not asking you to become developers, right? Unless you want to. You're going to be welcomed regardless, right? But the idea here is it's not as scary as it might seem coming in when you're used to racking and stacking servers, dealing with cable management, dealing with the full end-to-end infrastructure management, right? The idea of provisioning environments from code, checking it into source control, and then redeploying on the fly whenever you need it. It's a different world. It's a very different world.
For sure, yeah. And there's a learning curve when you start to do that as well, but there are a lot of resources out there for learning these things as well. So a lot of things that make it really simple, iterative steps to learn. I mean, look at you now, Shannon, with all of the Git processes that you use, and branching, and
I know.
doing all that fun stuff.
It
So
definitely doesn't seem as foreign. And I think the best part too is if you do feel like you are stuck, it's just a matter of don't be afraid to ask a question, because we're all having to come together. I mean, I think Matt, you even have had to have more infrastructure based conversations than you've ever had before. Now that we're blending kind of those two sides, sort of, when you're not going to 100% be infrastructure, I'm not going to be 100% dev, but there's a blending that can happen. And it's interesting how much more so that line is a kind of a murkier line. It's not as clearly defined.
yeah, and I think a lot of engagements that I get into now with customers is, on our national team, we use what's called a swarm model, where we have multiple CSAs that engage with the same customer, just because you have those of us who are more development oriented, and then we have those who are more infrastructure oriented, and you put two of those people together in the same room with a customer, and we can answer most of the questions that the customer will throw at us.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, so you'll write the code using the same tooling that your development team uses. So Visual Studio Code is the one that I've been using more and more. Although when I was first starting on this journey of understanding ARM templates more and more, I used Visual Studio. Matt, what do you use? Are you more Visual Studio Code or Visual Studio these days?
So I was the same. I was Visual Studio, and for me it was a matter of tooling. Once Visual Studio Code took off and all of these tools came out, all of these different extensions that you could install for Azure, for ARM, even Terraform, for those folks who use that. There's extensions for everything now. It makes it a lot easier to, look at mistakes that you've made, syntax highlighting, variables and things like that that you declare that you never use. So and even a visualization on the left of these are all the resources that you have. If you
Right.
don't see that visualization, that means that your syntax is probably a little off. You maybe missed a comma or a closing brace or something, but it shows you, and I want to go say I have 1,000 lines of code in this one template, and I'm looking for a VM, and I can go to the little visual viewer and go, oh, click on the VM, and it highlights that section, and then I can find what I'm looking for in that section. So
Yeah.
tooling now in Visual Studio Code has come a long way, and so I prefer Visual Studio Code now.
And it's everywhere. Whereas Visual Studio, the differences between the Mac version and the Windows version are pretty significant. Visual Studio Code, if you're a Mac user or a Linux user, you can run Visual Studio Code and have the same experience that you would if you were a Windows user using, say, Visual Studio, right? All of the great tooling surrounding it. Now, you can also use the portal. And I've used the portal here and there if I just had to do a very quick sort of deployment. You just don't have all of the baked-in tooling. And so it's also another option, but it's kind of one of those things where it may not be where you want to learn because you won't know if you are missing a bracket. You won't know if you're missing a comma. You will if you're using Visual Studio or Visual Studio Code. Now, you can also use the Visual Studio Community version, which is free. So a lot of infrastructure folks I've worked with over the years liked some of the ways that Visual Studio, you could add resources in literally by right-clicking and adding a resource. It felt a little less, I guess, different than embracing code outright. It was kind of a little bit on the GUI side, a little bit on the code side. So it was interesting to see the customers I've worked with embrace infrastructure as code.
Yeah, and don't let the talk about syntax and missing a comma or a bracket scare you. I mean, we have a new, I guess I'll call it a language, but it's really just it sits on top of ARM, but it's called Bicep, and it does make the syntax a lot easier, and that's one of the reasons why it came out, was so that it would be a lot easier for people to write readable infrastructure as code. So and without worrying about the whole, oh, I don't understand JSON, I don't understand the syntax, and I don't know what to put here. Do I use a comma? Do I not use a comma?
Right.
And things like that. So it makes it a lot easier.
Right. And we'll cover that in one of the future sessions for sure, because I feel like it's starting to gain ground and gain popularity. What it does is it converts everything to ARM JSON, but you're not dealing with the JSON. The Azure Resource Manager APIs are. So
Right.
that's one nice thing to think about, right?
Yeah, it's like a intermediary language,
Correct.
as they would call it.
Yep. Yep. So I think the last slide we've got here, and then we'll go through a quick video, the idea of the power of repeatability. So you've got idempotency. You don't have to worry about the fact that when you redeploy, it'll bomb out because something already exists in your template. It'll just move forward. And you've got the idea of being able to plug parameters in. You can simplify your orchestration. This has to go first, and then this resource. These resources can be built at the same time, right? There's some cool things that just happen automagically without too much effort. You can think about rolling things back, and then you've got, cross-resource configuration and kind of update support. So that helps you from kind of the getting environments consistent, having them be the same environment stretched across multiple environments. And then as we've talked about, you get the check-in capacity with source control. You can, specify resources and dependencies. This has to go before this resource. You can talk through, you can pull things out of Key Vault for your connection strings to a database. You can think through the parameterized input and output. And so we'll talk through when you would take that into consideration, just because of the fact I feel like parameters and variables, those are things that live inside of an ARM template. And those are like when to use a parameter versus a variable are going to be kind of some interesting conversation points as we move forward on this.
Yeah, and so here's one of the great things that I like about ARM templates, and one of the first things that kind of opened my eyes to them over, say, PowerShell or doing it, some other way, is that the way that you specify dependencies in templates means that if something doesn't have a dependency, it is deployed in parallel right away, right? So if I have 1,000 virtual machines that don't have any dependencies on anything else being created other than themselves, I just parallelly deployed 1,000 machines in 5 minutes.
Right, right.
And so then when you get into those scenarios where you might say, I need to deploy domain controllers with some web servers and or application servers or whatever, but those application servers have to be added to the domain, so they obviously depend on the domain controller being there first. That's where you get into the orchestration, and it's very simple in ARM to do that, to say, hey, this depends on this box being there, so I can't deploy this yet. And the ARM template will see, oh, he specified a dependency here on this machine, so this has to wait until that machine comes back and says it's deployed successfully before I can then roll on and do the next part of the deployment. So that's an awesome piece of power around ARM templates as well. And then I kind of wanted to double click on the word idempotency, because I don't know, that term is thrown around a lot, and I don't know that everybody understands exactly what that means. And so what idempotency is taking this thing and being able to deploy the same environment over and over again with the same result, right? So that means if I have deployed this template and half of it ran, and I deploy it again with the same parameters, the same names of whatever services, I deploy that again, it's not going to have two copies of one of the resources that already deployed. It means it's going to see that is there, it's going to deploy it, anything else that's not already there. It means I can then take that and change names and create my dev environment, change the names, maybe a couple of the VM size values or whatever we're changing, and deploy that exact same template and get the exact same result in test, and then deploy that again, maybe larger scale, maybe different naming conventions, things like that, and deploy it for production. And so I've used the same template to deploy dev, so I know that my environment in dev is deployed and configured the same as the environment in test, which is deployed and configured the same as the environment in production. So that's where you get this idempotency term, meaning I can deploy this thing a number of times and get the same result.
Yeah, good call out. I just kind of glossed over it real quickly. I didn't even think about going into that, but that's a good call out, because I do feel like it was a term that was a little foreign to me when I was getting more comfortable with ARM templates.
Yes, and that's how I roll. I like to take those things that people brush over that have these concepts, and make sure that they can be explained in simple terms, so that you then see that term idempotency now and people are like, what's that? And you're like, hey, I know what that is. That means I can do this, and it just helps people grow when you take some of these things, that some of these buzzwords that people throw around all the time, and you explain exactly what they mean, and then when people have that same idea of that term on the same page, then collaboration is a lot easier too, because we both know idempotency means this, right?
Yeah, agreed. So let's do this, Matt. I'm going to flip back to us for a second here. Matt and I used to work with, I don't know if we used to work with a guy named Gino, and Gino was the guy who originally showed this video to us.
Yes, I still work with
We can do a shout out to Gino, I suppose. Hi, Gino. He's going to be annoyed that he wasn't on here to give us a tough time. So the crazy part about this is, when I was becoming more familiar with everything surrounding kind of the speed of cloud, this video was shown to me, and I'm not going to show it with the actual sound here, because I don't think that's super relevant. But the idea is Formula One pit stops, right? And this was in 1950.
Pay attention to the time.
Yeah, and I might scoot it forward because it is a longer video. But you'll see the fact that there are a handful of people that have been designated to be able to work on this car. You see this guy hammering away at the tire,
while one other guy is swinging on this jack on the front until he finally
right?
gets down. Yeah.
Right. And it's a very slow process. And you've got, one person in charge of seemingly one task. You've got another person seemingly in charge of another task. Look at all of the other folks that are standing around there.
Oh, that one tire is almost done. He's got
Yeah.
the thing back on.
Right. Right. I mean, and this does take a little bit of time. Maybe what I'll do here is I'll scoot it forward a bit. So I think it's right around, yeah, because I mean, look, a minute and a half, almost, well, sorry, a little over a minute, we're starting to see it finally go away. I think, what was it, a minute and 20 seconds about? Yeah,
Yes,
and the car's ready to go. Well, fast forward to 2013, and this is where we are, right? Look at how many more people are here for the pit stop. It's almost triple the amount of people. There was, what would you say, like two or, yeah, we'll say four people before. This is maybe it's even four times the amount of people. And
and it's amazing what these guys do in the amount of time that they do it. Just boom, cars up, tires off, tires on, boom, he's ready to
that
go.
was what, like 2 or 3 seconds? Something? I mean, and that's what's happened here with the cloud. We're seeing environments being provisioned so much more quickly as a result of folks coming together, breaking apart long tasks, adding more people into the mix to handle certain components. It's just it's a really crazy reality. And once that was shown to me, and thanks Gino for showing that to us, I really like the fact that we now had a chance to build things out much faster. And it's interesting when you look at both of those two builds, or well, it's not a build, but both those two pit stops, and you equate it to a build. You think through the fact that something that would have taken months before could take literally minutes or hours. It's mind boggling. So there really is a power here of infrastructure as code. And hopefully throughout these sessions, you'll get more comfortable. And, we're always open to interacting with folks in the community as well if you've got questions, just because of the fact that some things might not make sense. And Matt is a fantastic explainer of all things. He's really good at breaking down everything like you're maybe 6 years old, so that there's never a question as to what's going on.
And that's probably because I have the aptitude of a 6-year-old.
I was gonna say, is it because you don't have a 6-year-old anymore? Your kids are much older, so.
They're much older.
Well, I think that wraps up today's session. So thanks for tuning in. I hope you found it valuable. Definitely feel free to subscribe, connect with us, and stay tuned for future videos. We'll start to demystify more of this process so it feels a little less foreign and a lot more comfortable as you learn how to code if you're an infrastructure person.
For sure, we'll be here to help you along.
Yeah, so thanks for tuning in, and we'll catch you on the next session.